Hello, good evening, and welcome to the Hague Talks. Happy to welcome you here today to this beautiful studio we have set up. My name is Connor Satley. I'll be our moderator for today's session on how we can all contribute to making a European identity. I'm joined by quite some brilliant speakers today, and we have a really engaging program, including questions from all sorts of participants that are joining us both remotely and here in person. Before we get started, I'd want to give you the quick lineup of who's joining us today and what our theme is. Our theme, of course, is making a common European identity. As Germany enters a new post-Merkel era, with several challenges facing EU cohesion, the Hague Talks investigates the notion of a European identity. The past decade has seen several challenges to the idea of Europe, with uncertainty growing on whether or not there's more shared by Europeans than is held apart. Are we seeing the development of a common European identity? If so, in what ways can this be seen? How is it seen from the outside, and is a common identity something to be desired in the first place? Joining me to help explore these questions, please welcome a great lineup of speakers, including, to my right, we have Amir Maniee. Amir is a translator and blogger, forced to leave his native Iran due to his religious and political beliefs. A true bibliophile and former academic, Amir is enrolled in Leiden University's inclusion program and is a passionate believer in rationality and free thinking. Amir provides his own personal perspective as an emigré on the importance of these beliefs in the foundations of European identity. Amir, you're very welcome.
Thanks.
I'm going to do the same thing with you as with all speakers and pose a frustratingly complex question that I'm going to force you to answer in 30 seconds so that we can get just a taste of who you are and how you think. Your intro has a lot to do with free thinking, but here I'm talking about a common European identity. How do you reconcile everybody thinking for themselves, but then people somehow coming together to think the same thing?
I believe that European identity is not an absolute term or absolute notion, but it's something that we can find a sort of spectrum of definition for that. But it is not a clear-cut thing, and I believe free thinking is an integral element in the European identity.
In 30 seconds, I think that's as complex as we get. We're going to come back to that later
Sure.
for sure. Next to Amir, I'm joined by William Murray. William Murray is the senior editor and coordinator for Links Europe, a foundation based in The Hague, promoting the peaceful resolution of conflicts and a secure and prosperous Europe in friendship and solidarity with its neighborhood. A Brit living in The Hague, he will share his own personal perspective on how he identifies with Europe and whether or not it has changed in the last 6 years. Will, you're very welcome. And for your frustratingly complex question, I have a question about strength and diversity for you. At the same moment that Europe can treasure the diversity of having so many different cultures and peoples in it, this can also create conflict. So do you see it as a strength for Europe that it has this diversity, or is it potentially a thing that is stopping this common identity from forming?
Well, it's a frustratingly difficult question, and I think it's at the heart of actually what we're discussing here, to be honest, Connor. But I do feel that the idea of the emphasis that we place on the diversity is important. I think that there's diversity in any identity group or any community, and I think that there is this myth of homogeneity that we must avoid. So I do think that it's a strength of Europe, and I do think that it can define actually European identity at its core.
Thanks, Will. We're going to dive in more into it later.
Sure.
But we're joined also by, now digitally, by Chiara Cesari, who is an associate professor in European Studies and Cultural Studies at the University of Amsterdam. Within her research, Chiara is passionate about memory, heritage, art, and cultural politics in Europe, and the colonial legacies that are still present today. Chiara will share her perspective on European identity in relation to this research, as well as her own personal life coming from an Italian background. Chiara, you're very welcome. Can you hear me okay? Are you joining us properly? Yes, we see you here on the screen. Chiara, I love that you included art in your introduction, and I'm curious, why do you think art and this sort of cultural expression of music and painting and movement and dance, how does that contribute to European identity?
Well, first of all, identities for me are first and foremost a cultural constructions. It's something that we imagine and enact in our daily life, and arts are exactly what helps us imagine the future also and fill it with new meanings and more inclusive meanings. So art is imagination.
Art is imagination. I love it. We're definitely coming back to that because as a musician myself, I'm going to ping you on a couple of those ideas. Thanks, Chiara, and you're very welcome. So for now, I'm going to say goodbye to Will and Amir and Chiara. Thank you for joining us. We're going to come back to you later. But to kick us off, we're going to hear first from Robert van Asten. Can I invite Robert to come join us? Robert van Asten is the City of The Hague's Alderman for Mobility and Culture. Robert, you're very welcome.
Hi, nice to be here.
Welcome to the HagueTalks. So I'm curious, as you were presented with the topic of this event, and I invite you to address our audience here, what does this European identity mean for you, mean for the city of The Hague?
And I will start. Thank you. Hello, everyone. I would like to start by expressing my gratitude to the HagueTalks Youth Board for organizing this event along with the support of the City of The Hague and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Additionally, a big thank you is in place for Beeld en Geluid for making this beautiful location in their media museum available for the recording of this event. And lastly, I would like to thank all online viewers at home, and hopefully we can create as much interaction with this as with in-person events. I'm very happy and thankful to speak to you today on Human Rights Day. Today is a special day for Europe. More than 70 years ago, cooperation in Europe started to take shape, step by step. In those days, so soon after the disastrous Second World War, there were still shortages of everything. But of one thing there was no shortage, and that thing was hope. Hope for a better future, to live in peace, freedom, and prosperity. And it is for this reason that freedom and human rights are the key elements that connect Europeans across this continent. Since the 20th century, The Hague was gradually evolved to become the international city of peace and justice. One of the key moments for this was the Peace Conference of 1907. One of the most famous speakers at this conference was Bertha von Suttner, the first woman ever to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. In an era of extreme nationalism, she stood for the pan-European ideal, a united Europe as a guarantee of peace. Unfortunately, the time was not yet ripe for the idea. But her ideal for Europe, united in peace, freedom and prosperity, lives on to this day here in this city. And on this day, December 10th, I would also like to make reference to the fact that on this day, 110 years ago, Mr. Tobias Asser was rewarded with the Nobel Peace Prize. He received this honor for his efforts for the Hague Conference on Private International Law and the establishment of the Permanent Court of Arbitration here in the city of The Hague, also places where people meet and discuss their differences. Nowadays, The Hague and Europe are connected in all sorts of ways. Our city is home to 31 European organizations, which employ more than 7,000 people. The Hague is very active in the Conference for the Future of Europe. This conference was launched last year by the European Union to bridge the gap between inhabitants and the EU. The Hague, as a center of Dutch democracy, attaches strong importance to providing inhabitants a platform to raise their voice. And together with various partners, the municipality organizes a number of events on the role of the EU in sustainability, digitalizations, resilience, and the position of the EU in the world. And we invite all citizens, including you, who are watching at this moment, to join this event to determine the future of our European continent. I myself feel European and believe in the power of European unity. As the Deputy Mayor of The Hague, I have the privilege to be representative of the European Committee of the Regions, this official advisory body of the European Union, which represents local regions across Europe. Many of the challenges of the 21st century, such as climate change or the risk of digital disruption, can only be addressed by European solutions. During my work at the Committee of the Regions, I have noticed that Europeans are more connected than we initially think. And while we are not the same, and we sometimes think differently, we share history and a mindset. Earlier in my speech, I spoke about connecting Europeans. By working together, The EU can provide peace, prosperity, and personal freedom all over the continent. And it is often forgotten that these privileges are not guaranteed for everyone and everywhere. That is why I believe we should work hard to maintain these privileges, to ensure that everyone has the same possibilities in life. A shared European mindset can play a major role in achieving this. Shared fundamental freedoms that we all have in a democracy are a great example that allow Europeans to relate to one another. However, there might not be one clear definition of what this European mindset, European identity exactly is. What does being European mean to you? Do you feel European? Today, different perspectives on European identity are presented, and I look forward to the stories and the discussions today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Robert, I was struck with a couple of things you said about determining the future, the people that are on this call, but I was also struck by how much you helped us understand the past, going all the way back to, I think, brilliant visions of European identity from 100 plus years ago. Thank you for helping us situate what we're talking about here historically today, Robert.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay, then let's jump in. After having been now put in context, I think, thanks to Mr. Van Asten's introduction, I'm happy to welcome back our first speaker, Mr. William Murray. Please join me here, William.
Thank you very much, Connor.
Of course, Will. Thank you, and I would say the floor is yours. I'm looking forward to hearing more about this concept of strength and diversity, and also hearing your perspectives, both, I would say, as a Brit before and after Brexit here in the Netherlands.
Sure. Well, it's interesting that you bring that point up in the first place, because when the Hague HagueTalks team asked me if I wanted to speak today, I genuinely felt quite hesitant, because I felt, is it really my place to define the European identity? You know, you can feel as European as you want, Will, but at the end of the day, you're no longer a European Union citizen, and you should really step back from this kind of thing. But whilst these two things are connected, I really believe they're not the same. I mean, citizenship is a legal status, and the European identity is self-determined and somewhat more complicated, but no less important. And I must add that whilst European identity is more than the European Union, I sincerely believe that there is a role for the EU in helping to mold this identity. And I'll get to that shortly. As everyone knows, me and my compatriots lost our European citizenship in 2016 to a 51-49% referendum. And I'm sure that these people in the 51% had myriad reasons for supporting Brexit. And I believe that for some of them it was a legitimate and desperate cry for major change. But with so much insecurity and a lack of realistic promise on the one hand, and what felt to me like a glaring loss of so many benefits on the other, it always felt to me as though, regardless of rationale, these people cannot have felt particularly European. And I think there's a reason that seemingly menial things like the colour of the British passport seem to take on such a role in this. I mean, this return of the blue passport was a bold visual example of this rejection of one form of identity for another. And considering this paper-thin margin, I strongly believe that if we had been able to nourish more of a European identity across the continent in advance of this, I really can't believe that Brexit would ever have happened. So what things must, in my mind, we absolutely consider when we're looking at supporting, nourishing, creating a European identity? I think that, crucially, this European identity absolutely needs to be compatible with this wide range of national and personal identities that are held by people on the continent and across this part of the world. In Brexit, we saw an othering of Europe, and not just from the Leave side. I mean, I have to note that many Remainers that I'm friends with, I know that they decided to stay with the EU, you know, with them, not stay as part of it or because it defines them, you know? And for many, I think in the UK, there was this assumption that for those living within the rest of Europe, they felt European first, and you know, those Europeans and then us Brits. And because I feel British first and maybe European after, well, then I'm not quite the same as these people. And so I think that, you know, it would be ridiculous to say, for instance, that you cannot be a Feyenoord fan and a Dutch national team fan. I think we need to look at this in the same way. I think that if we do, at this point in history at least, make people choose between national identity and European identity, the national identity will win out. And I think that the people that want to subvert European society understand this well, and that's why they do so much work to make these things seem incompatible. I don't believe we can necessarily create or prescribe a European identity, and I don't think we should, frankly, but I do believe that we can help nourish identities that already exist in Europe. I think like any identity, when one defines it, you inevitably exclude certain people and certain groups of people. And so whilst I think we should loudly proclaim our general values, our tolerance, our visions of equality, our liberalism, our faith in the rule of law, I think a European has to be able to be a European regardless of their political leanings, in the same way that a Brit is a Brit regardless of their political leanings and whether I like them or not. I think that whilst European identity should be based on these values and principles, like national identity, people must feel free to give it attributes that they associate with themselves, and it cannot be allowed to exacerbate any further these political divisions. So what can be done in this mission to create or to nourish what already exists? As I said, I do think there's a role for our leaders. I do think there's a role for the European Union itself. And I think the fact that my feeling of European identity, as I described earlier, has been somewhat impacted by the legal decision made by Brexit demonstrates that sentiment and legislation from above does have an impact on grassroots levels. Discourse from those with power is powerful, and our leaders must also be very careful, I think. There's a commonly cited trope that UK governments were always very happy to take credit for the good done by the EU, but then to scapegoat them when things went wrong. And I think there's no doubt that this type of rhetoric led to an othering of the EU in this context. So I think that if the leaders of the EU 27 are serious about European cohesion, they must be very careful in the way that they speak about the EU, even if they're disagreeing with it. I'm not suggesting that they shouldn't, but freedom of speech is one of our shared values. But people have to also be given a reason to feel European, and I think that the reasons may be lacking for too many people. And I think when I consider EU initiatives or aspects of the EU that help to promote a feeling of togetherness and cohesion, I think the first things that come to my mind are freedom of movement and initiatives such as the Erasmus programme. But whilst I think these things are fantastic, I ask to what extent do they benefit the average EU citizen? I mean, in 2020, only 3.3% of working-age Europeans resided in an EU member state other than their own, and the Erasmus programme is only open to people in higher education. So what's in it for everybody else? I think that, please, such things have to continue, but without opportunities and incentives provided by the EU for others, I feel like we risk only exacerbating these elitist European stereotypes which the average person cannot and will not simply associate themselves with. Fundamentally, we need to make people feel proud to be European. And firstly, I think we need things that celebrate the sheer diversity, as your initial question raised. I think we need to normalize taking pride in each other's cultures. I mean, whilst a Dutch person isn't an Italian, and vice versa, I mean, with the exception of Chiara, I heard her speaking Dutch earlier, so she may blend this together, but may not necessarily be an Italian and vice versa. I think they're able to share in the best things about their culture, and via an association can feel somewhat proud. I mean, when I first went to Georgia, which is a country that's population feels very European when polled, and it's considering applying for EU membership in 2024. I mean, I had the food and the drinks, and I met the people, and I experienced the culture, and I just kept feeling, if this isn't European, then I bloody well want it to be. You know, not because I can become a Georgian, but because I think it enriches this tapestry of brilliance that's across Europe. And I hate to give this example, but they are few and far between, and I think we can be doing more of this, but the Eurovision Song Contest is an example. I think you may be expecting this to come up today, but you know, watching Eurovision with my friends earlier this year, several of them remarked, this makes me feel so European, and it's not something that they often thought about, but you're able to see glimpses into this eclectic and kind of slightly absurd tapestry of things that are happening here, and actually feel proud to be a part of it, you know? But secondly, we need to celebrate our togetherness, and we need to find more ways to do this. I think national identities benefit, for instance, from they're often built through things like sport. But with the exception of the Ryder Cup, I think there's almost no major European or international sporting competitions where Europe competes as Europe. And whilst the EU must be careful not to step on its members' toes here, I feel like there's low-hanging fruit. So throughout the Brexit campaign, you know, the European identity was often ridiculed by the Nigel Farages of this world as, you know, something artificial, loyalty to a trade bloc. And we need to find ways to make Europe and the EU tangible things that exist, you know, and I think visible collective endeavor, such as sport or something else, is one way of doing this. So to conclude, I won't take any more of your time, but going back to where we started, I may no longer legally be a European citizen, but I do remain European. And I think it would be an incredibly weak identity if I allowed it to be dictated by legislation and the color of my passport. And if we are to form a strong and stable European identity, it must be appealing enough for the hundreds of millions of Europeans across this part of the world to want to embrace it too. Do we need a European identity? I think, of course we do. I truly believe that there's more difference within our nations than there is between them, talking about diversity. And I think that at the end of the day, we risk a real instability on this part of the world if, as we've already seen from Brexit, if we don't do something about this. And I think that Brexit could end up being the tip of the iceberg. But aside from this, I think identity and action are fundamentally connected, and that's why I gave some very tangible things that I think the EU can be doing. I think, you know, one's actions reinforce one's identity, and one's self-perceived identity then informs the way that one acts. So if people in Europe believe that the European project and Europe is part of who they are, then they'll commit to and support it wholeheartedly. And in this world of ever-increasing instability, I think we need a strong Europe and a strong European identity now more than ever. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Will. I think at this point, had we an audience in person, they would be rising out of their chairs and applauding. Let me give you the warm embrace of the audience in their stead. I found this both refreshingly honest and open and very personal, but also very pragmatic and very realistic as to what works and what doesn't. So thank you for kicking us off with this message. We're going to go now to questions from the audience. For those of you who are watching digitally, please feel free to put your questions into the chat. Our tech team here will be relaying those to me. But before we go to the chat questions, we do have a video question. So let's hear from one audience member first. Go right ahead.
Hello, my name is Lucas. I'm from Luxembourg and also a student at the Masters on International Relations and Diplomacy in Leiden. I find that there's often a tendency when trying to describe the idea of a European identity to define it through essential components, and often that's quite difficult, and therefore the idea that there could be such an identity is quickly dismissed. However, I believe the same would happen if you were to try to describe any national identity in that way. However, we don't dismiss the idea of national identity. So my question then is, how can we better frame the idea of a European identity so that we don't get stuck in essentialist discussions and maybe move on to understanding European identities as an outlook instead?
Will, it's a brilliant question from our neighbor to the south. How would you respond?
Well, thank you very much, Lucas, for your question. And as I said at the beginning, in the starter question, I mean, I think that this does form the central argument of what we're doing here, because how do you create an identity that's based on diversity whilst creating a feeling of togetherness at the same time? I mean, I think looking at the UK, I always think a great example is how American popular culture portrays the UK. And you'll have an American come up with a kind of northern Cockney accent with the airs of a Victorian aristocrat. And it's kind of like this amalgamation. And it's because, you know, these are all very different British people, but they're all just as British as each other. And this myth of homogeneity, I think, that exists within the idea of identity means that, well, if they're all British, then there must be a Cockney Northern Victorian aristocrat, you know? It doesn't exist. And I think that there's no single thing that brings every person in every country together aside from the fact that they're a human being. I think what Lucas says there, in a sense, for me answers the question. I think you don't want to define European identity, but he said, how can we reframe it? And I think that that's what we can be doing. We need to be creating a framework of values that are more strongly and more loosely connected to what it is to be European, but none of which contradicts a large proportion of society's view as to how they see themselves as being European, if you know what I mean.
I do know what you mean, but aren't we being a little bit utopian here? Can a framework really include all common values if some of them are even sometimes violent? I don't think I really want to go out and eat right now. Oh, we're back. Hi, sorry. Looks like we had some connection problems there, but I'm getting a thumbs up from the folks in the back. Are we back and connected? Nobody's saying no, so I'm going to assume it's a yes. So sorry for that little clip. I hope that we didn't lose any of Will. If so, I'll just make him repeat word for word what he said earlier, and he'll do fine. Don't worry. I'm sure he had it memorized. But I'm joined now by Amir Maniee. Welcome back. It's nice to have you. And I'm curious, as you've sat here and listened to Robert von Asten, as you've listened to William Murray, I'm curious how their ideas have struck you and what your perspective is on this common European identity as emigré. Amir?
Sure.
The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks the Hague Talks for your invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. It's a very interesting topic, a European identity, not the European identity, but a European identity. So that by itself indicates that our personal opinions has a lot to do with what this identity is, because we do not use the article "the" for European identity. But what I want to say first is that the answer that to this question would be yes, no, or perhaps I don't know. I'm on the side of the yes, the positive answer. And I argue why I would personally feel and connected to a sort of a European identity based on my own opinions. First of all, I should say, what are the borderlines of a European identity? Can we define it as a very clear-cut notion, something which is very absolute, or the edges are blurred and there look like some gray areas? So I believe that, at least from geopolitical or sociological or linguistic perspectives, it might have some blurred edges. But those blurred edges do not mean we cannot find criteria or values that are traditionally European. Values that contribute in making a European identity. So what are those values? Those values or those criteria make my definition of what a European identity is. For me personally, the most integral part of the European identity, even before I lived in Europe, and now that I live in Europe, is the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment of the late 17th and 18th century. So I believe that the Enlightenment is the fruit of a long philosophical quest. Ideas such as free thinking, freedom of expression, secularism, separation of church and state, objectivity, liberalism, education, and shaping democratic institutions and constitutions, political liberty, and, of course, the very attention that was given to the humanities within the academia. So I believe that these elements, they constitute the definition of European identity, at least for me. But there is a counter-argument to my definition, and that counter-argument is quite an interesting one, because one might argue that some of these have been present in other geographical locations at some other times. They're not necessarily exclusive to Europe, and they do not make an identity of Europe. To answer this, I would say that, yes, there might have been some instances elsewhere through history, but the period of late 17th century and 18th century Europe was the first instance in the history of the human beings where those ideas and values shaped not only a country but a continent as a whole. And more importantly, those values were consistent and not temporal. And that was exactly the moment science highly flourished in Europe, because thanks to a free democratic society, the grounds were well prepared for moving forward. Thus, what Europe relies heavily on is this academic and sociopolitical achievements of the late 17th and 18th century. So in other words, what I am enjoying today is the legacy of those people who fought for it, for those values, in those days in Europe. Specifically, I need to mention one single name, which is very much important, very much integral. Of course, there have been a lot of figures, and I highly revere all of them, but there is one single figure, and that is Spinoza. His ideas have been and are very much integral within this whole process of shaping a European identity. His ideas of rationalism and the power of reason. So I believe that Spinoza is the common denominator of a European identity. So now I would like to talk a little about my whole story and why I feel connected to the European identity. I come from Iran. I was born in Tehran, and for those of you who are not maybe familiar with the country very much, in the past 42 years, Iran has been ruled by the Islamists, and which is quite in contrast with what the people are in Iran, because I can claim that Iran is a very secular country and people are not religious, but we don't have this platform to show the authentic information about Iran. Usually the media is controlled by the regime. So I was born within an Islamic country, and then if I want to mention a very important date is 1979, which is the revolution of the Islamists in Iran. There are some keywords about that. Before the 1979 revolution, we have stability in national and international levels, social and economic prosperity, secularization, education, and freedom. Whereas after 1979, instability in national and international levels, social and economic poverty, Islamization, ideological indoctrination, and oppression. Within that context, I was born after the revolution, of course. So I found, because I was born in a secular family, and well, I had the access to world literature, to philosophy, to different languages, whereas that was home, but at school there was Islamization and indoctrination. So it was very easy for me to find out this paradox. And this paradox led me to admire deeply these values that I talked about, like free thinking or secularization or rationality. And so, but I was not a passive person. I was a proactive person. So, and no matter how much price that I had to pay, I always wanted to speak up my mind and to protect those values, to be critical. Still here today, I have not changed. I'm the same person, and I'm protecting and defending the same values. I always say that, for example, in Iran, you have freedom of expression, but what you don't have is freedom of post-expression. So you can say everything, but there's no guarantee what happens to you, Connor. Do you want to try that? Okay.
Perhaps someday. But
yeah. And then at this, so in those years, I was very concerned with it, and I tried to be very proactive and to change the mentality of the people surrounding me and the people, and to promote rationality. So those years passed, and then I wrote so many different books, and I got to know Spinoza and other famous figures of the Enlightenment. So I highly revered the political freedom, the liberty, the rule of law and order, democracy, and free thinking and separation of the church and the state, all these values within Europe. So those values are still with me today. That's why I say that that is our common denominator to define a European identity, because the edges are blurred, and no matter how much they are blurred, there are some elements that we can, and at least I can, consider them as European. And I highly cherish them. So the other point that I would like to say and wrap up my discussion here is that without this democratic foundation that we have had in Europe, it would have not been possible for me and you standing over here to talk about this subject or any other subject peacefully and to criticize each other's point of view. So this is a very precious legacy, and we have to protect it. And I do really feel that it is really in danger, and we have to protect these values more than before. And we have to remind, especially the young generation, that what they have, they should not take it for granted. Yes, this is very much important.
Thank you so much,
My
Amir.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm sure that we're going to get questions from the audience, so please put them into the chat, and we'll see which questions we can bring in. I know that I've got a couple, because I want to drill in on a couple of these points. But first, we do have a video question from the audience, so can we hear from you first?
Thank you for considering my question. In light of the ongoing pandemic, my question is really about how we as Europe, with a European identity, can navigate these tough waters, while on the one hand, keeping in mind national interests and what different people from different countries would like, and on the other hand, keeping in mind that we are Europe, we are united, and how can we combine these two?
To you, Amir.
Okay, first of all, to have a national identity has nothing to do with, or it's not somehow in conflict with, to have a European identity. You can keep your, for example, you would say that, okay, I'm from this certain village, or from this certain town, and from this certain city, and from this certain country. I'm a Dutch, but also I'm a European. Those values that I explained, they are not exclusive to Europe, although Spinoza belongs to the Netherlands, for example, but David Hume belongs to Britain, or Montesquieu. This is the way I see it. You can keep your national identity while keeping your European identity too.
And I'm curious about that because we already have a question in the chat, which somebody has already taken my question, so I won't co-opt it, I'll give them credit. But somebody in the chat asked, thinks that European identity is a philosophy. And I'm glad that it's addressed to you, Amir, having quoted a few philosophers in your time here on the stage. Is European identity a philosophy in itself?
Yeah, it could be, we could say so, because that takes us to the definition of philosophy, what philosophy is. But if we say that philosophy is about good thinking, or it's about a certain attitude, yes, I would say so.
Okay, and I have one other question before we move on to the next speaker, which is, I guess, your perspective as somebody who has come to this continent, who saw these values and said, that's where I want to, these are the things that I believe in too, I want to share these values. I guess, how have you felt over these last few years of looking at immigration as a European concept, and in terms of a policy set of Europe? How does Europe's perspective on how to handle its immigration for emigrés that come here and want to be a part of this identity affect the identity itself? Is it an expression of identity? Is it as a result of that underlying value set?
Well, first of all, I think immigration by itself has a lot of, let's say not a lot, but some reasons. Some of them have not been in the hands of the European themselves. Something happens somewhere else by the mistake or by the policies of somebody who is not in Europe, and Europe is paying the price for that. This is the first thing. The second thing is that immigration has been something that has been happening in the history for a long time, due to many different reasons, whether it would be for a better place to live in terms of the climate, sure, or better chances of survival. But I believe, personally, again, I believe that if people really respect those values, if they respect those values, then you cannot shut the door. But if they cannot tolerate the values which are integral within the European identity, then I would say that for those people, Europe is not a good place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I know earlier I gave you an impossible question to answer in 30 seconds. I may have just done it again, but with the minute or two version, but I appreciate you weighing in.
My pleasure.
So Amir, thank you for sharing your perspective with us. Thank
Sure.
you for sharing your story with us. It was really nice to have you.
Thanks.
We'll see you back again soon for some more questions.
Absolutely.
Yes? Okay, thank you, Amir.
Great.
Next up, we have another digital address. Before we get to Chiara, we have a video that was sent in by a participant who would have been very happy to be here to join us today, but instead sends his video remotely from Laurens Dassen, who's the head of Volt Nederlands. Laurens, the floor is yours.
Hallo allemaal, mijn naam is Laurens Dassen, fractievoorzitter van de Europese partij Volt in de Tweede Kamer. En ik ben blij dat jullie vandaag met elkaar het gesprek voeren over onder andere de Europese identiteit, over Europese waarden. Maar ik denk ook belangrijk over Europese samenwerking. En dat is ook een van de redenen dat ik politiek actief ben geworden. Namelijk een paar jaar geleden verbaasde ik me en werd ik ook kwaad over het feit dat Brexit gebeurde. In een tijd van klimaatverandering, waarin we sociale ongelijkheid hebben, de macht van de grote techbedrijven, migratieuitdaging. En dat zijn allemaal uitdagingen in mijn optiek die we alleen maar samen kunnen oplossen. En daarvoor hebben we de Europese Unie en de Europese samenwerking heel hard nodig. Nou, op het moment dat er dan één land is wat zich afscheidt, dan vraag ik me af, zijn we wel met elkaar de juiste richting op aan het gaan? Dat is ook het moment dat ik politiek actief wilde worden, omdat ik altijd geleerd heb van jongs af aan. Op het moment dat je samenwerkt, kom je veel verder dan dat je iets alleen wil doen. En als je het dan hebt over die Europese waarden, over Europese identiteit, dan denk ik dat we die met elkaar in Europa zeker delen. Rechtvaardigheid, waarbij wij vinden dat iedereen een sociaal vangnet moet hebben. Dat lijkt misschien allemaal heel logisch, maar dat is iets wat ze buiten Europa lang niet altijd hebben. En daarnaast ook de rechtsstaat, de democratie, iets wat we echt in Europa met elkaar delen. En ja, tuurlijk, die rechtsstaat staat onder druk en daar moeten we ons hartstikke hard met elkaar voor maken. We zien het in Polen, we zien het in Hongarije, we zien het in Slovenië. Steeds vaker zie je wel dat er met de rechtsstaat gemarchandeerd wordt. Nou, ik vind het ook belangrijk dat we daar als Europeanen ons voor uitspreken. Want ik sprak laatst met enkele Poolse rechters en die gaven ook aan, heel veel mensen in Polen willen juist onderdeel zijn van die Europese Unie en vinden die rechtsstaat heel erg belangrijk. Dus laten we ook zorgen dat we daar als heel Europa ons voor blijven uitspreken. Maar ook de waarden van vrijheid, die wij hier in Europa met elkaar delen en die echt anders zijn buiten Europa. En natuurlijk ook de Europese cultuur en identiteit die we ook met elkaar hebben. En waar natuurlijk ook grote verschillen tussen zitten. Net als dat er een verschil zit tussen de Brabanders, die ik een ben, en de mensen uit Noord-Holland. Maar we delen ook heel veel zaken juist wel in Europa, in de cultuur. Die democratie die we met elkaar delen, maar ook muziek van Bach, waar tegenwoordig disco-muziek op wordt gemaakt. De Duitse auto's, het Italiaanse eten. We hebben een hele rijke historie in het continent die we ook met elkaar delen. Alle verschillende talen. Dus ook dat is voor mij allemaal die Europese identiteit. En ik vind het prachtig dat we dat met elkaar delen. Ik denk dat we die verschillen ook moeten koesteren. Daarom de spreuk van de Europese Unie ook, eenheid in diversiteit. Laten we daar trots op zijn, laten we dat uitdragen. Laten we daar ook niet bang voor zijn. Vind ik dat er in het politieke debat te vaak de Europese waarden en identiteit gelijk wordt gesteld met de Europese instituties. En dat is natuurlijk niet zo. Wij als Europeanen maken wat Europa is. En de Europese Unie is een middel om die samenwerking tussen ons Europeanen alleen maar te verbeteren. Nou, en ik denk ook dat we daar heel erg gebruik van moeten blijven maken. We hebben als Europa nu enorme uitdagingen. Klimaatverandering, de digitale transitie, sociale ongelijkheid. Natuurlijk ook een veranderende wereld met een opkomend China en een Verenigde Staten wat zich terugtrekt. Ik ben ervan overtuigd dat wij die toekomst met elkaar vorm kunnen geven als we gebruik maken van de ideeënrijkdom van 450 miljoen Europeanen. Om schone lucht te creëren, om een goede natuur te creëren, om te zorgen dat iedereen mee kan, dat er goed onderwijs is, maar ook dat grote bedrijven een eerlijke belasting betalen, zodat we in een rechtvaardig, vrij continent wonen, wat ook nog eens heel duurzaam is.
Thanks a lot, Laurens. I notice a lot of the common themes amongst our speakers from before and what Laurens has to say, but Laurens is the first person to mention Bach being made into disco, which I feel like is a very important point. We can't end the event without mentioning that. Thanks, Laurens, for reinforcing some of these concepts around European identity, unity, and diversity. Thanks for joining us. Also staying now on the remote feed, I'm happy to welcome Chiara de Cesali. Chiara, I've butchered it, just like I promised I would, but it's lovely to have you here at distance, and would love to hear from you. You've now had the benefit of having listened to all of these speakers so far, so now you can tear them all to pieces if you wanted to. But I'm happy to give the floor to you here at distance. Chiara.
Thank you, Connor. I thank you for inviting me to share what will be, I decided, mostly personal experiences, my own personal trajectory through European landscapes and in and out of European landscapes and identities that I believe resonate with a broader history that's it's of relevance for our discussion today. I just wanted to start by saying that for me, Europe and European identity is first of all not one thing. It's diversity, it's multiple things, and is mostly a question, a debate, an interrogation, and a criticism of the politics of identity. So it's a very particular kind of identity, or should be a particular kind of critical identity, and I think this is good, and this is a resource. I start my story with a very positive story of expanding Europeanness. In the middle of the 90s, I was living in Milano, where I was born, and I decided I moved to Germany on an Erasmus program, on an Erasmus fellowships, together with a very good friend of mine. And that was kind of an important moment, because after the Erasmus, I decided to stay in Berlin. And then actually, I never went back to Italy ever since. And I remember very, very strongly how back then we were feeling very strongly and very passionately European. There was this sense of very positive connotation. It was, of course, a moment of expansion of the integration project, and there was this enthusiasm attached to being part of this making of Europe. That was something that was enlarging sort of our horizons, giving us possibilities, putting us sort of including a bunch of different people in our sort of growing community, and putting people together who were feeling connected despite perhaps having been in different schools and having watched different TV programs. So it was this moment of very positive Europeanness and expansion of the horizons of Europeanness. Then after a few years, I started working in the Middle East, mostly on museums and archaeological projects that were run by European teams. I've worked with the Dutch teams, German teams, British teams, and particularly in Syria, which is of course now a completely different place. And working as European and within European teams in Syria on archaeological digs and museums really showed me the ongoing power and legacy of colonialism. I very much felt what we were doing back there in collaboration with the Syrian authorities back then, with the Ministry of Antiquities and of Culture of the Syrian regime. We were digging up amazing Assyrian and Babylonian sites, destroying Islamic tombs and the upper layer, because they were not considered very, very important. This was, Islamic stuff was not considered important. What was important was the cradle of European civilizations and the Assyrian, the Babylonian stuff. And a lot of it was sort of the knowledge was taken back to Europe, and some projects were done with what was practically the local dictatorship. So it was also about propping up the regime. And after that, I quit, and I was very uncomfortable with what we were doing there, even though it was presented as scientific progress and helping sort of poor Syria getting out of its underdevelopment. But it was a lot about robbing Syria. And really, I really saw this, the sort of how colonialism was still ongoing, bringing wealth to Europe and leaving profound devastations on the ground. After this, I went to do my PhD in the US. I spent 6-7 years in the US, and then I came back to Europe. And that was the late 2000s. And when I came back to Europe, the political landscape was different, very different. The integration project was very much in crisis. And at the same time, I felt there was, curiously enough, a resurgent sense of European superiority, mostly evident in the narrative of Europe as beacon of human rights, while at the same time, you know, I could see sort of the mounting, for example, racism in European society, and the contradiction between the narrative of Europe as a beacon of human rights and the fact, for example, that people kept on dying or left to die in the Mediterranean, while claiming their rights as asylum seeker, as people, claiming their rights for a better life. And after this, in recent years, I've been very much part of the whole debate about the sort of the post-colonial debate in Europe and how Europe should sort of reposition itself and rethink itself in relation to the question of post and decoloniality. And now I just want to end with a couple of ideas that I think are rather theoretical. This is what we discuss with our students in European studies at the UvA, but I think are important. First of all, identity is it's not one thing. It's not a thing and it's not one. It's a project, is an imaginary that is socially produced. It's about how we feel, where we feel we belong and how we feel we belong. It's profoundly entangled with diversity. I think identities are always diverse, multi-layered, historical. They are always contested. We always give different meanings to identities, and we struggle sort of to get our meanings across. And I think it should be about a reflexive identity. European identity should be about a reflexive identity that is aware of the problems attached to the question of identity and identity's exclusions. Because often, you know, the fact that sort of, if we say Europe is one thing, this means that people are not immediately tied to that thing. They are not considered of Europe, even though they live here. And so identity should be about taking responsibility. I think responsibility is a very important term. Taking responsibility for one's sort of Europe's history, also of violence and sort of devastation that it has wrought on other places in the world and certain categories of people and its own citizens. And also in the positive sense, really should be the name of an horizon of possibilities, of justice, in my view, of possibilities to reimagine identities in inclusive, expansive, multivocal ways. And I want to end with a word of caution, because I think it's very risky to promote a common European identity in the singular. Now, a lot of European EU cultural policy projects and projects dealing with identity, on the one hand, celebrate diversity, very often is national diversity, but tend subtly, indirectly, to come back to this idea of a one single cultural identity. which in a way is a bad copy of the old idea of national identity. Now, I really think that it's the problem, this discourse of creating one European identity to support the political integration project is very problematic, is the wrong answer to the problems of integration and the reemergence of ultranationalism, because first of all, because it's just a lukewarm copy of national identities, and also because it doesn't recognize the profound, again, the plural and sort of ongoing traveling process, which is identity and identification. And I end here.
Thank you so much, Chiara. Yeah, I think a really valuable perspective to have. And I've got about 500,000 questions. I've filled up an entire page, but we also have a video question from the audience we're going to go to first. So first to our audience to ask a question.
Good afternoon, The Hague. Thanks to the speakers for being present at such a wonderful event, and thanks HagueTalks for organizing it. My name is Rodi. I'm a third-year international studies student at Leiden University, focusing on Europe. But right now, I'm a diversity and inclusion intern at the municipality of The Hague. My question for the speakers is as follows. To what extent is the identity of the European Union based on a post-colonial or normative power Europe ideology? Thanks for answering.
Chiara, did you get the question? Have you heard it properly? Go right ahead then.
Yeah, I've heard the question. I mean, it would take me quite some time to answer the question. I do believe that, indeed, I do believe that if we are talking about European EU cultural policy, I think there has been so far a tremendous lack in terms of in terms of engagement with the colonial and post-colonial question. Again, I always put the post in parentheses, because I do believe that coloniality is still, and the colonial legacy is still very much part of our present. And I do believe that this is something that should be dealt with, and it hasn't been done, I would say, it hasn't been done so far at the level of European cultural policy, but I hope that the sort of the current social mobilization around issue of coloniality, ongoing coloniality of our public spheres and our sort of our society, and debates about decolonization, I think they will sort of reach out and are starting to change things also at the level of major institutions.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Chiara. We have a question coming in from the audience that is going to be pretty similar, I think, to the question that I had for you. I'm just waiting for them to type it out here for me. This debate on colonization, I'm curious, and so is our audience, on whether you think a European response or from the nations in question that, let's say, had very direct ties themselves to the colonial history, which level does it deserve, does it require a response from, do you think, as we grapple with that history?
I mean, I think in a way both, and I tend not to see the two levels as sort of incommensurable. In fact, I think they sort of they do work together, and they should both engage with the question of colonialism, because there are certainly, there are individual national colonial histories. The Netherlands has its own particular colonial trajectory. Italy has its own colonial trajectory. Other countries, for example, in Eastern Europe, have a different relation to the colonial question. So, but at the same time, it is certainly a broader European issue as well. So I don't think that one excludes the other. And so far, I mean, I think there have been, I would argue, problematic arguments saying it should be the nation states, the nations, to deal with colonialism because it's their own responsibility. At the same time, I think this has helped for a while sort of nation not to engage with the colonial issue, always by saying, because what's the official discourse is always, oh, okay, the Belgians were worse, the British were worse, and we were not that bad. And so I think all different levels should be represented in the debate.
Okay,
And
Kiara.
again, because it's a matter of responsibility, it's not a matter of guilt, it's not a matter of shame, it's a matter of taking responsibility for what is a legacy that has ongoing and humongous repercussions in the present. Now, I'm not going into the whole question of, climate devastation, climate change, but that's also an important component.
Sure. And I have a question for you as well before we let you go, before we bring back everybody actually and engage in a broader discussion, which is you mentioned some strategies that you feel aren't working. They're just, I forget exactly what you called it. You called it reheated or lukewarm copies of what nationalism is. And these arguments tend not to be so convincing, let's say, or they lose out in the marketplace of ideas. So I want to go back to where we started with me asking you about art, culture, heritage. Do you think that these, Will mentioned sports and culture that might express itself in, say, Eurovision. Do you find these more convincing ways to bring people around to this way of feeling that you've been talking about?
I mean, absolutely. Of course, this is my own personal view. I'm also a mega fan of Eurovision, and Eurovision is one of the moments when I'm proud to be European. And I love that. I do believe in the power of popular culture, and I do believe in the power of art in, again, helping us think beyond the boundaries and sort of the constraints of the present. Because art is the place where you don't need to think, okay, what's realistic? In a way, it's the opposite of politics, I guess. I'm not a politician because I think politics always has to do with all kinds of limitations and a little bit too much of consensus building. And art is the place where you can say, okay, let's not think about sort of the constraints of the present. Let's imagine what we'd like to have, and let's reimagine what we have now, and let's project it into the future with that sort of freedom, which I think is needed for making sort of a leap forward.
This is a vision I can get behind for sure, and I share your enthusiasm for Eurovision, if not only because I'm the fan of the Italian band. It's Måneskin, right? They won it this year. Oh my goodness, those guys are great. Thanks a lot, Chiara, for this intervention. Appreciate you. Let's bring on Will and Amir again, and we're going to enter sort of a general discussion. So you as audience members, if you have questions, please put them into the chat, and I'll do my best to address them to the speakers as long as we don't run too much out of time. But we're going to start again with a video question. So once more, we start with you, our audience.
Hi all, I'm Rijk. I am a student at the Master's Program International Relations and Diplomacy at Leiden University, and I have a question for you all. Throughout my research, I found that the value of European solidarity is argued to be a big part of European identity. However, it is not always realized through policy or felt by the people. I was wondering to what extent you believe the value of European solidarity is an integral part of the European identity.
Chiara, can we start with you at distance here? Did you hear the question, and did it come through okay for you?
Yes. I profoundly believe in solidarity. I think this is, I believe in partnerships and solidarity, partnership, collaborations, doing things together, and solidarity, and thinking across across difference, because we are all diverse, and yet I think it's solidarity and the capacity not only for empathy but also for solidarity is really across difference is really, I think, a very crucial feature of humanity, and sort of the best part of humanity. I'm a little bit, in a way, it's a bit of a theoretical answer, but I don't think solidarity should stop at the borders of Europe, wherever they are located and wherever you want to place them. So I wouldn't give it a geographical or political boundary.
Sure. And Amir, how does this strike you as the question on solidarity as a part of European identity?
Yes, I believe that solidarity is a universal value, not necessarily a European value. And then just like a lot of other things, good or evil, that are universal, So solidarity is one of those. As if, for example, you are reading a play, and, for example, you're reading Shakespeare, okay, and then you are enjoying it as somebody who comes from Britain, but somebody in South Africa, in Latin America, would read the same and enjoy it. One of the notions, for example, within the play could be solidarity. So it's a kind of a universal value, and I wouldn't consider it as exclusive to Europe. Yeah.
Will, you've had the most time to think, so I'm going to add a layer. Can solidarity be misused? I imagine you're for solidarity in the European identity sense. Stop me if I'm wrong. But how could this concept of solidarity be used actually against the European identity? Do you see arguments against it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what Chiara said there was very interesting, that it shouldn't just be solidarity from a European perspective. I think, I mean, we would be completely ignorant to think that, you know, our world just stops at our borders. We need to be in solidarity with our European neighbors to the east and the south. We need to be in solidarity with other people around the world that share our values. And of course, solidarity in the direction, if it's heading in the wrong direction, it's not necessarily a good thing. But I think I have a trust that in our diversity, in our creativity, and in what we have as Europeans, if we are in solidarity working towards important things, I think we're very, very, very capable of doing so. I mean, when you have a team of people in any successful project, you're going to the best team is not going to be one that's made up of clones. It's going to be one that's made up of lots of different groups, different people, different ideas. And I think that when you take this diversity and then you point it towards something which people can work towards in solidarity, I think we can make considerable progress on whatever that is. So, of course, solidarity is not fundamentally a good or a bad thing. Sure. I think that it depends on how we direct our attention.
And you pointed back to Chiara, your address on solidarity, sort of if we imagine solidarity is outside of the European Union. Chiara, you might say, if I'm sorry to put words in your mouth, but as you explained your experience being in Syria, I think perhaps that's an example of where more solidarity could have been applied, right? Outside of Europe. Am I correct in saying so, Chiara?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But in general, I mean, I sort of, because of my trajectory, I really have a fundamental issue with borders, because I also think that borders very often, they function for some people and not for other, or they let some people pass and not others. So again, I don't think there is a border, should be borders to solidarity. And in fact, this is part of, perhaps this is what we need also to reimagine identities in a way that is more, in a more just way, which was actually the original idea of some of the thinkers, the European thinkers, when they thought about the meanings of a new European identity. People like Morin, people like Derrida were thinking of it in terms of an identity which does not constitute an other, which is not based on exclusion, but it's about inclusion. So it's an identity that has no borders, like Eurovision.
Yeah, well, sure. I was going to refer to Eurovision again, because we all know over the last, now we're getting into the Eurovision promotional routine here at the Hague Talks, but over the last couple years, wasn't there, some subdued outrage, but outrage nonetheless, that what is Israel doing? What is Australia doing? Hey, is that actually Europe that we're seeing in Eurovision now? So then, I don't know. I mean, just from my perspective, just to play devil's advocate here, borders are easily understood, right? I mean, is this concept of there shouldn't be borders to an identity, to an idea, it should be solidarity outside of Europe. Will, you were talking about Georgia earlier, and I've myself have loved Georgian cuisine and wine and traditions and people. But hang on a second, once you start talking about Georgia being part of Europe, this is a controversial topic, right? So where do we land on this? If borders are so easily understood, if it helps people define the edges of this identity, and Chiara, I know you'll have a problem with this because identity is not one thing, but I want to go first to Amir. Where do borders play in this concept of identity for you? How fuzzy are they? Do they exist in the first place?
We cannot draw a line like the way we do it in mathematics. No, but at the same time, we could say that this area is, let's say, a dark gray or light gray. For example, St. Petersburg in terms of those values that I mentioned earlier, is, to me at least, is more European than Moscow. So in that sense, I would say there are no borders, but you would reach some areas where you feel that, well, I don't feel that much European here. Again, within that definition that I mentioned.
Sure.
Because one of the foundations of that definition was the democratic institutions and freedom of expression.
Yeah.
So if you take that as your guidance, then you would see that within Europe, there are some areas that you do not find that very much European, although they are geographically within the European boundaries.
So we're talking about feelings. Will, you mentioned for the 51% of people that voted the UK out of the EU, they certainly must not have felt very European. Chiara, you told us that European identity is not one thing. It's a project, an idea, and a feeling. So how do we change this? How do we bring this feeling into hard legislation? Chiara, you pointed out the failure of maybe certain pieces of legislation, like translating it into policy now becomes the very difficult part. So in one sense, we feel this, or people can identify around a common feeling, but how to translate it into action? Will, can I start with you?
Sure. The last two questions, I think, are quite similar. So we're talking about hard legislation, and we're talking about hard borders. And I think that we must avoid this temptation to be hard about this. We're not going to have a conference on the future of Europe, get everyone around the table and go, right, guys, we've got 3 hours, and we'll print this up, send it out to you, and we've got the border situation down, we've got the identity down, we've got these points of legislation. Partially because half of what Europe is will not accept that. It needs to be a conversation. I thought that what Chiara said about identity being a question was so interesting, because, I mean, if you look at how borders have changed across Europe over the course of the last centuries, they're moving all the time. I mean, the identities that we have at a national level, half of these countries didn't exist however long ago, you know, and these things can feel ancient and seem ancient. But we're not going to be able to put anything down which will stand the test of time necessarily. Unless, I mean, another point I think I want to bring in is that Chiara mentioned, you know, an identity without an other. And I think this is such an interesting concept because, as I say, I think part of what became the British identity in Brexit was not being European. And whilst you can't agree on what makes you British, not everyone likes the Queen, not everybody has the same accent, you can at least agree that we're not them. It's a lot easier to bond people around this idea. I think that we can come up with more broad ideas, but other values, we should be othering values rather, that we don't like. We can say that Europeans are not authoritarian, and we can stamp down and come out very loudly as not just the European Union, but Europeans in saying that. I think we can say that we are not illiberal. We can say that we are not intolerant. And I think that we should other these distasteful values, not down to a really specific legislative level, but I think in very general terms, these ideas and these discussions, which we should continue to mold and continue to embrace, I think that they can inform the way that we move forward. But no, I do not think that hard legislation can define the European Union identity,
Okay.
European identity, rather.
And the one thing we said more than anything is Chiara said that. So Chiara, as we pull words from your intervention and we put words into your intervention, what have you reflected on as you've heard now Will and Amir with this question around hard legislation, hard borders, Will's concept of othering the other values as a way of strengthening your own? Where does this stand with you?
Okay, I was thinking of two things. First of all, something that I've tried to write about and make sense of is that indeed when, I think the Brexiter, they didn't want to be with the EU, but many of them do have a feeling, in my reading, of being European, but is a Europeanness which is very far from what they perceive the EU to be. So, and unfortunately, I would argue, is a sense of Europeanness that is in a way common to, according to sort of studies that we have done, to a number of ultranationalist movements in Europe. So is a connection to a Europeanness of past grandeur, of past colonial grandeur, that those people hope it will come back. And actually, that those people believe that their own political project is directed at reinstating, reproducing, recreating the old, arguably imperial grandeur of the old nation state. So I do think that often ultranationalists do have a sense of Europeanness, unlike what we might think in the sort of intuitively, even though it's a kind of very problematic Europeanness, I would argue. And the other thing that both intervention made me think of, and these are the words of an academic. I am not a politician, so I can think of in terms of histories and theories and sort of projections into the future. Of course, I mean, people, identities are about feelings, are about strong connection, very often with a national project. But I want to sort of remind us how this is a historical phenomenon. It's not natural. This has to do with the development and of the form of the nation state as the fundamental and the prevalent form of political organization in the modern world. So because, in a world without nation state, we wouldn't be thinking of national identity and national borders and so on and so forth. Now, this doesn't mean, I mean, my argument then is not we should destroy the nation state and all that comes with it, even though I don't like the whole the apparatus, imaginaries, and tools of the nation state, but I think it's quite hard to dismantle it. Yet I do believe that Europe should be also a platform to try think beyond it. And this is why I say we shouldn't copy the identity model of the nation state, even though it looks so successful, it gives people a lot of certainty. But yeah, indeed it was successful, very successful. And it made a nation state a reality and the foremost reality of our political world. But again, I would like to push a little bit in terms of thinking for the future that is unconstrained of the immediate political realities.
Thanks, Chiara. We're hitting our wrap up in about 5 minutes, and so even though I think now we're just getting into the heart of it somehow, I feel like we're just getting into the core. I'm going to ask one more question from the audience, we'll make a quick round, and of course it's the most complicated, which is about the migration crisis. A question from the audience came in about the migration crisis. Can it help boost or channel more of a feeling of European identity? Let's just go around. Amir, can I start with you? I mean, this is a pretty interesting phrasing of question, I think, not about it being a threat or hurting, but could this boost or channel more of the European feeling?
Migration has its own positive sides, and also it has its own negative sides. Like I said before, it was not the first time in the history of human beings that this has happened. So it is our responsibility, the decision maker's responsibility, to minimize the negative sides of migration and to maximize the positive sides of migration. Migration by itself, we cannot attribute whether it's positive or negative. And I believe that the decisions that are taken within the national borders of Europe and within the European community as a whole has a lot to do with the results that we get out of migration. Just as an example, the way we use education as a tool, especially, again, for example, many of these immigrants that are coming to Europe, they have kids, and the way they are taught at school has a lot to do with what result we would get in 10 years' time or 20 years' time. So firstly, it has to do, this question has to do with the decision makers' way of dealing with the immigration.
Okay, and Will,
or migration.
your thoughts?
Well, I very much agree with all of these points, and I do think it needs to be managed correctly. I mean, I think that the enemy here is fear, and I think that if people fear migration and people fear the unknown, then that's when they're going to be more likely to pull away from it and move back from it, and probably try to take security in these national identities and a rejection. I mean, with Brexit, we saw again and again and again, Nigel Farage used it to his benefit with these queues of people and saying, you know, Britain's closed and all of this, and it's trying to create fear, and there was a suggestion that the EU was imposing this on the countries, and I think that if the countries allow narratives like that to take hold, then that's how it will be seen. I know there's fear from the national leaders to take ownership of migration decisions, for instance, when they worry that they might not be popular. But by allowing the EU to be the voice on this, then I think it does damage Europe's credibility, and I think that. It's not to say this is fundamentally difficult. I think that if they work together, they can show more of this positive side of things than just the negative.
And Chiara, finally to you.
I mean, of course, there would be lots of things to say. I just want to, in addition to what my my colleagues in the panel have said, I just want to point out the ways in which I believe that in the public sphere there is a tendency to represent as migration as something that is external to Europe and something that is coming into Europe. While I would say that what would be very important is also to make more visible how migration is a fundamental part of European history and is not something outside of it that comes into Europe to threaten European, but has been a fundamental, also like Amir was saying, a fundamental motor of engine of history. And we are all, I mean, I myself, I'm a migrant, of course, a privileged migrant with a good European passport, but all, and I think that we all have come from histories of migrations of different kinds. And I think a problem is this representation of migration, not only as a negative factor, but as an external factor. And, and this fact, and of course, a correlate is that something is not something that you stop the moment you close the borders.
Thanks, Chiara. I think good to keep in mind, especially as we have migrants sitting around the room today. It's something important that we mention. Keep in mind and keep it loud, I think. So thanks, Chiara, for wrapping it up. Go ahead, please. If you were going to add something?
I was saying if we look closely, we're all migrants.
Sure.
Again, with different degrees of privilege or discrimination.
Sure. And I think as we spent tonight talking about feelings and getting a common identity, I think that's something that at least the 4 people sitting here can certainly agree with. Thanks, Chiara, for wrapping us up. That brings us to the end of the event. Would like to thank the Municipality of The Hague, the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Bel dan Geluid, and HagueTalks Youth Board for organizing this Hague's Talk. And also, of course, the speakers, Robert van Asten, for reminding us that the people who are determining the future also should understand where we have come from. Amir, same thing, for bringing us all the way back to the Enlightenment to find these great values that we can all identify with today and knowing where their origins are. Will, the strength of identity, not as part of yourself, not as part of a policy or the result of somebody's political decision, but as a feeling of who you are. And Chiara, identity not just being one thing, it's a project, it's an idea. And of course, fuzzy borders all around. I think we all agree on that one too. So with that, we're happy to wrap up. Thank you so much to our audience, for those of you who are participating and gave us some really great questions to grapple over here. We thank you. And we're happy to let you know that the Hague Talks will continue all throughout 2022. We'll have another series of events coming. And keep on the lookout for the HagueTalks podcast. We'll be launching a podcast with the HagueTalks with all of these great speakers that you had here today, with them able to give their thoughts in a little bit more of a free-flowing session without this moderator cutting them off every few minutes. So thanks, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.